Start with our next session. We heard in the previous session extremely powerful personal stories and really a proof that these threats are real. They're not just virtual, even though when they happen in a virtual environment and virtual space, they are very real and they have an impact on people's lives. So in this session, what we are going to try and do is look at how we can address some of these issues, some of these attacks. What are the legal instruments? What are the instruments on an international level? What can international organizations do? What can national organizations do? What can government do? But also what can journalists do and what can journalists associations do in order to combat these threats and these attacks. So I'm very pleased to have today with me on the panel, to my right, Maja Fjärstad, who is the State Secretary to the Minister for Strategic Development and Nordic Cooperation of the Government of Sweden. On my left, Audun Atlason, a Permanent Representative of Iceland to the OSCE. Then we have Judy Tang here, who is from Article 19. She specializes in free speech on the internet, hate speech and religious intolerance, access to information and protection of human rights. And she's currently leading the new Article 19 program on gender. Then we have on my right further Aidan White, who is who was the General Secretary of the International Federation of Journalists, and he created the Ethical Journalism Network, and he now runs the Ethical Journalism Network, and he's a journalist of great experience. And then Caroline Hammarberg, Associate Expert for Section of Media Freedom and Expression at UNESCO. Caroline is main area of focus is on freedom of expression, freedom on the internet. She was working on a publication on digital safety of journalists, and she's now currently working on protection of journalistic sources. So we have a wide variety of views and expertise on how we can tackle these threats. So I would first like to ask Ms. Fjärstad to give us a very broader overview from the political perspective, what should be done and what can be done to combat these threats. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the stories shared here in the previous session. And I think that they represent a very strong base that we can continue the discussion about and actually discuss what can we do, how can we use the legal frameworks, and how can we actually use politics to do something about this very threatening and alarming situation. So I represent the political perspective here today, and it is also easy to start by, of course, stating that internet in itself is a very positive power, and the internet has given a world with new opportunities to express ourselves and share information. And a free and open internet is, of course, not only a driving force for development, it's also a democratic resource. But we know that there are many threats to a free and democratic internet. And the risk is that we actually lose the internet we know and no longer can use the internet as a democratic force. And I also think that we must acknowledge the fact that women are specifically targeted by threats online. And we also, I think, have to start with the fact that it is the same patriarchal power structures online that in everyday life. It is the same harassment, it is the same oppression that women face in their real life or in meet space that they face online. And it is these power structures and these patriarchal structures that is the basis of the problem. And a very basic principle that is also, of course, stated from the experiences in the previous panel is that the same laws and rights must apply both online and offline. A threat is a threat, of course, regardless through which medium it is expressed. And another point of observation is that threats online are sometimes a start of an escalating pattern, that they are sometimes effectuated physically. So there is every reason to take threats online with the most gravity. And of course, abuse online of female journalists is completely unacceptable, not only because of the personal consequences that are very serious, but they are also a threat against freedom of expression. And they can have a chilling effect of freedom of expression and also of the public watchdog role, that the role of journalists in public debate generally. And I also think that offenses committed against a journalist, they can be seen as an attack on democracy and freedom of expression and such, and that can actually also, I think, be considered when a penalty is determined for these kind of threats. And we see among several worrying trends that the freedom online is decreasing. The think tank Freedom Online has showed that for the fourth consecutive year, freedom online is decreasing. And this tends to affect already vulnerable groups such as women's organization and civil society. And the development takes place both through attacks and messages which are perceived as controversial, but also women and women's rights are threatened and harassed, and that means that women are leaving the internet. And this, I think, is a real threat to a democratic internet. We need a multiple of voices online, and we need civil society online, otherwise we have no democratic internet. And the Swedish government are eager to strengthen gender equality and improve women's access to technology and increase women's organization online. And that is what we call a feminist foreign policy. And I would also like to underline the role that civil society has in these cases and in actually watching freedom online and in watching women's rights online. And in principle, I think that the internet has real possibilities as an emancipating technology. Online, it doesn't matter which gender we have. We can express ourselves in a free way. And it can give women a voice in societies where women are not allowed in the public debate or not even in the public space. But threats and harassment online affect women much harder than men in the society we live in. And I think it is time that we acknowledge that this is one of the major democratic and political issues of our time. And I don't think we can underestimate, actually, the results that these kind of harassments continue. And let me also state that Sweden appreciates and values the professionalism of Ms. Mijakovic and her team, and we fully support the mandate of the representative. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I would like to ask Aidan White to give us a presentation linking the threats that we have heard about and what can be done by international organizations, international community, and media outlets themselves to combat these issues. Aidan.
Thanks very much indeed. First of all, I want to apologize because not for the first time in my life I'm speaking out of turn. I was due to be speaking later this afternoon, but I have to leave you very soon after I speak. So I apologize for that, and certainly I apologize to my panel that I'm going to miss this afternoon, which is a real loss. First of all, I want to thank Maya for, I think, setting the context for this debate and this discussion, which seems to me that the social, political, economic and conditions and cultural role of women in society and how women are treated is actually the root cause of what we're talking about today. And you can't isolate a sort of particular aspect of it without being aware of the need to confront other issues as well. And I think this question of setting context is really very important, because in the very first session, I was very much taken by some of the interventions which actually talked about the difficulties that there are inside media organizations to try to raise these problems and so on. I'm here speaking on behalf of journalists and on behalf of media, and to do so, I have to be very realistic. I have to be very honest and open and say it's a terrible situation, trying to raise issues like this and to get them taken seriously inside journalism and media. But it's not a lost situation. It's not something that actually we should put to one side and say media are a lost cause in this. I don't think that at all, no matter about the difficulties. The other thing I wanted to say, it's a global problem. And the nature of the global problem is, earlier this week I was in Delhi at the International Association of Women in Radio and Television Conference, where this very issue was actually central on the agenda, about this whole question of online abuse and so on. So the real need to make links between what's going on in this region and elsewhere is very important. I want to just very quickly go through a couple of points. I want to try, if I can, to be as practical as possible. But it's one of the things that we're doing in our organization, which represents professional groups and so on around the world, is we're trying to focus on particularly, and in the context of, for example, the migration story, which is being played out not very far from here, full of tragedy and drama and good journalism, but also hatred and bad journalism as well, it's very important for us to sort of see how we deal with the images that we use and the words that we use. And the importance, therefore, of confronting hate speech has been one of the most significant, I think, challenges that we have tried to address in the young life of the organization I represent. And trying to find ways of looking at hate speech and analyzing hate speech is very important. So we last year launched a campaign called Turning the Page of Hate to try to find new ways inside journalism of raising the discussion and working out how we deal with this issue and so on. Particularly working in Africa and the Middle East, where these problems are absolutely immense. Hate speech, as we all know and so on, but it's where it has recognition internationally, it tends to have been focused on questions of intense hatred, and particularly hatred that would incite violence related to racism and ethnicity and so on. There are a whole number of other issues which aren't properly sort of dealt with and recognized, but which are equally important and so on. So the question that's come up all the time this morning was, what are the limits? Who draws the red lines, which define the frontiers of tolerance and so on? It's a question every day that journalists and media organizations try to deal with. This picture or that picture, this headline or that headline. Each choice that's made carries with it a statement of a narrative, a view, and it's very important that when journalists are making these decisions, they are aware of not just of their responsibilities, but they have the freedom to be able to take them without being subject to forms of self-censorship. And I judge self-censorship as journalists and people working in journalism who are forced by the nature of the political conditions and very often economic conditions to practice journalism in a particular way, which is not editorially independent, but which is actually defined by the specific interests of particular interest groups, whether they are commercial or indeed political. So we have developed a hate speech test, which is a 5-point test for hate speech, which tries to help journalists and media to be able to identify that just because someone says something outrageous, that doesn't make it newsworthy. That actually we have to sort of understand that people say outrageous things all the time, and we heard them this morning. And the point about it is what we mustn't do, and what we're very dangerous to do, is we mustn't give them greater currency or respect or circulation than they deserve. We have to report them in the context in which they're said. So the position or status of the speaker, the reach of the speech, which is very important, the intention of the speech, the content and form of the speech, and we heard that the content and form of online abuse, knows no boundaries, knows no sense of decency, and certainly not humanity. But most importantly, perhaps, the question of the nature of speech in the economic, social, and political climate in which that speech is made. And again, we have many examples of that today. So one of the issues we need to look at is that journalism itself and media themselves, by the way that they work, sometimes are guilty of, let me just go back if I can, are guilty of contributing to the seeds of hate that actually give rise to the abuse that we have. The whole sort of problem about gender stereotypes that remain in place and which are used by media and so on. The question of notions of cultural exceptionalism, which we find in many parts of the Middle East and in Africa and elsewhere, and of course here, that reinforce discrimination, and it in effect denies the universality of women's rights. Myth-making and blaming the victim. These are sort of constant themes that you find in journalism, where journalism actually adds to and gives prominence to myths and ideas that the victim themselves have brought it on themselves. And we heard this morning that is really a very, very strong part of the problem. So media can contribute to this. And I wanted to sort of say that actually I'm going to make a few recommendations about what policymakers can think about doing and what media should think about doing. But first of all, I wanted to sort of say there's a really nice story about, in the end, persuasion and good argument is probably not enough. We actually have to work together, build solidarity, and take an activism. And you just use this example. It's a great example of the question is it free speech, or actually is it in the interest of civilized discourse in the public arena? In 2013, Facebook were called upon to combat hate speech involving sexual violence against women. And the company issued a statement saying it was the classic free speech statement. No. You know, no matter how offensive, repulsive, and awful these comments are, you know, distasteful content on its own does not violate our policies. Well, that's the easy thing to say. But in this particular case, a campaign by 100 advocacy groups exposing the content, showing the violence against women, and significantly recruiting the support and the economic muscle of global companies who began to threaten to withdraw advertising to Facebook caused a volte-face within Facebook. And suddenly, within weeks, a new statement was issued by Facebook, which said that Facebook saw that there was a case of the need to act over gender-based hate. So I think this was an important lesson for us. So the policy action points that I would like to sort of draw attention to is we need more industry-wide actions to raise awareness and to learn from the success that there has been within the industry in raising the profile of safety of journalists as an issue to a level now where I think action is beginning to be taken. And this is a sort of an aspect of it which needs to be dealt with. We need to ensure that hate speech and online abuse are part of updated materials for journalism schools. We need to establish useful and important dialogues with the internet industry. And I think it's fair to say the internet industry has come a long way in the last few years. I would say in the last few months as well. We see a lot of a change in attitudes about the need to sort of set standards. We need awareness raising through public information work, and we need to promote self-regulation principles. I myself contributed to a wonderful little book produced by the OSCE a couple of years ago, which produced guidelines for journalists and so on. But actually, it's already out of date. I mean, it's a great book. It's already out of date. And it just needs to be redone. And I think that with the specific section related to what we're talking about here today could be extremely useful. So, I mean, I think there's this need for the policy at political level is important. Finally, the question of the media action points, I think. I can't stress too often the difficulty that there is in trying to get traction inside journalism, inside media, for discussion, not just of this issue, but a whole number of issues related to ethical performance, the need for good governance, and the need for transparency in the media industry. So we need much more social dialogue. I was very grateful for the comments that were made earlier by the European Federation of Journalists, colleagues related to the need for social dialogue. We need to involve the workforce in the process, and I think this was referred to earlier. And we need to involve representatives of freelance groups and so on. It's true that the majority, biggest expanding area of journalism is the freelance sector and so on, and the freelancers need to have a voice. We need to have internal support systems for women staff. That really seems to me to be extremely important, so that women can raise these issues. I think the experience from NRK was actually really interesting and useful. And NRK is a sort of classic example of an organization that can respond, but actually it probably ranks among 1% to 5% of the sort of total media audience that we're talking about. So we need to somehow find a way of introducing staff training, the capacity to identify and eliminate hate. We need to have standards for moderation. How do we set standards for moderation? We need to bring the industry together to talk about these issues and so on. And above all, I think we need to sort of get media to reach out to their audience to try to promote more partnership on social networks and with advocacy groups altogether. But finally, actually, I think anything that we do in this area has to also be targeting one of the great deficits that exists in the media industry today. And that's a real failure to confront the problem of the status of women in journalism. we have too few women who are media leaders. We still see discrimination against women in terms of their working conditions, in terms of pay, and so on, a lack of access to these sort of basic facilities. So I think that this whole question needs to be put forward. We need to engage the industry, but we need to do it as part of a continuation of programs to improve the status of women journalists and to improve the profile and status of women, not just inside media, but within society as a whole. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Aidan. We are aware that you will unfortunately have to leave us now and will not be here for later discussion, but thank you very much for this input. I would now like to turn to Judy, who will elaborate on some of the human rights instruments that are available and that should be used to tackle these issues. She will also try to define the issues that we are dealing with. Aidan already started doing that to an extent, so Judy will elaborate on that, and she will also suggest some of the ways forward where we can take this discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Frane. I find it difficult to find a starting point in this discussion. You know, the title of this talk is Digital Threats Targeting Female Journalists, and there's so many elements just to that title in itself, in terms of international law and as an international organization, how to address this. We're looking at the online sphere. That in itself has a whole breadth of legislation, international law looking at it, looking at the status of an individual as women, so looking at legislation focusing on non-discriminatory practices, and looking at journalists as well, and that's protected under international law. So the international legal framework is quite robust in terms of the topic we're talking about. And I notice that when we talk about this, we tend to go online, offline, real world, cyber world, female journalists to journalists as a whole. And I think that's because the topic we're talking about has so many elements of intersectionality. As an international organization focused on freedom of expression, that's our mandate at Article 19, we came across this dilemma as well. So we've since refined our work into like 5 key areas trying to advance freedom of expression. We look at transparency, digital world. We're looking at civic space and the right to protest. We're looking at the media. We're looking at protection as well, and all these different elements. And then we took a step back and realized that in addition to all of these core themes in advancing freedom of expression, we also need to have gender as a thematic theme as well. And it's quite new in terms of having it be a thematic focus, but it's not new in terms of us working on it. And the reasoning and the thinking behind that is that it has to be in the forefront of our minds in order for us to adequately address it from a free speech organization. So I think to start, I want to give a context in terms of the international environment and the international framework in which we're talking about protecting female journalists online. And so firstly, we have looking at the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and looking at non-discrimination, equality, and universality. So there's Article 1 and Article 2. Article 1 is all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. And I'm going to summarize these just to, in the interest of time. Article 2 is everyone is entitled to all rights and freedoms in this declaration without distinction of any kind, such as race, color, sex, language, religion, political, or other opinion, national or social origin, property, birth, or other status. And there's also other regional instruments as well, such as the European Convention for the Protection of Human Rights that addresses non-discrimination elements. So universality is one of the key tenets of human rights, and I'll get back to that in a minute. But now looking at freedom of expression, so the right of the individual to speak, we have Article 19 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is where my organization takes our name. And this says, everyone has the right to freedom of opinion and expression. This right includes freedom to hold opinions without interference, to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas through any media, regardless of frontiers. So it doesn't matter if it's on the streets, or if it's in a school or university, online, in an email, or in a chat room, on Twitter, on Instagram, you have that right. It doesn't matter where it is. And now looking online, so I just described it in Article 19 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and also the International Convention on Civil and Political Rights. There's also, as Junior mentioned earlier, the UN General Assembly Resolution on the Promotion, Protection, and Enjoyment of Human Rights in the Internet, as well as There's been many statements by the special rapporteurs about further elaborating on what it means to have freedom of expression online. And now looking at the status of women. Women are further protected. There's other conventions as well, such as the Convention on Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, and also the UN Beijing Platform of Action, which focuses on removing obstacles to women's public participation in all spheres of public and private lives. And this Platform for Action actually sets out key points, key areas that must be addressed to ensure that women have equal participation, and media is one of that. Now, these international and regional instruments are critical. They're very important. In and of themselves, do they solve the problem? And I think it's been clear this morning that the answer is no. So what do we do with these regional instruments, these international instruments, and what is Article 19 doing as an international organization? I think it's really great that in the first panel, Caroline brought up that this is not just an internet problem, that it's a societal problem rooted in misogyny. And where is misogyny rooted, how does that manifest itself, but within hate speech? And it's really great that, although Aidan's not here anymore, that he elaborated upon hate speech, because I think that one of the key challenges in addressing gendered violence and obstacles to freedom of expression from a gender perspective is really getting the facts right, disaggregating our information, and doing proper research about the attacks that are happening, the motives, the nature of crimes. And with that comes really dissecting hate speech. It's really promising that the Ethical Journalism Initiative is using the 5-point test. Article 19 has been working on this for quite some time as well, and it's rooted in our work in looking at religious hatred and incitement to hatred. And it's a 6-point test, which the United Nations has adopted as the international test for understanding whether something reaches a threshold of hate speech that is grounds for restriction. I think that also it's really important to, and I'll elaborate on the 6 points, but firstly, I think it's important to take hate speech and break it into 3 categories. The first category is that category that meets the threshold for restrictions, that requires criminality and is grounds to be removed or stopped. The second one is an area where it's more appropriate to address it with civil action and taking it away from criminality and the penal code. And the last one is hate speech where it is offensive and hurtful and has societal implications, but does not necessarily reach the threshold for the other 2. And with that, I think there needs to be a large discussion about how to address that element of hate speech. I think it's important to really understand those 3 forms of hate speech because it enables us as individuals and groups or governments addressing hate speech to be more targeted in our approach and to be more effective in our approach. Because it's really ineffective to look at offensive speech which hurts someone's feelings or has societal implications in terms of perhaps perpetuating a misogynistic norm and trying to address it with the penal code or addressing it with takedowns. So I think it's really important in this discussion for us to understand the different elements of hate speech. Now looking at that highest threshold, the threshold that are grounds for restriction, Article 19 has a 6-point test, and actually the first 5 points matches those of Aidan, so I'll go through it very quickly. The first test is the context in which the speech is. So is it online, offline, is it at a rally? Then it's the speaker. So is it a politician? Is it a 14-year-old boy? Is it coming from a bot on the internet that only has 4 Twitter followers? So where is it coming from? The next one is the intent. So is the intent, is it a joke? Are they joking? Is it a 14-year-old boy making a very poor joke? Or is it someone actually with the intent to perpetuate hatred? Then we have content. So what is actually being said? And then we have the extent and magnitude of the expression. So how far does it reach? And also, the 6th point is the likelihood of harm actually occurring from all the elements above. And the reason why I want to dissect this is because I think as those of us addressing it, we really, really have to be very nuanced in terms of understanding why gendered violence happens and why obstacles to freedom of expression on the basis of gender happens. I think it's insufficient when an attack happens on a journalist to say, attack on a journalist happened to a female journalist, violence against women, violence against female journalists, the government takes action, and that's it. I think we need to really break it apart, saying she's attacked because she's a journalist, firstly, but the nature of her crimes is gendered. So she experienced sexual harassment, She was threatened with rape. Her family was followed. So I think that we have to really break it apart to really be effective. And in not thinking as critically, I think we run the risk of running in the same place for a very long time. So what is Article 19 then doing about this situation? We realize that in our work in advancing freedom of expression, we have been progressing in many areas. But when you disaggregate the data, so this is just a hypothetical, say we advance it for 100 people each year in X location, which is a success. Without further disaggregating that data, we might see that they're predominantly men and that we're leaving out certain groups. And so what we are trying to do now moving forward, and in terms of starting a gender program, is ensuring that not only do we promote freedom of expression, but we promote the universality of it. And promoting a universality of a right is more than just putting a law in place. It's more than just conducting a broad training, but it's actually having a targeted approach to tip the power balance back in a place where women have equal access to that right. So what are we doing? And I'm going to give this example because I think that it's good as an organization working on these issues to be self-critical about how we've been approaching it so far. And we're looking at now in 3 different ways. So in terms of our strategy, so I explained we have media, transparency, protest, civic space, protection. So looking at those issues and understanding which elements of those require, or not require, but will have more impact from a gender standpoint. And then moving from there, then we have to look at how we operationalize that. So for instance, another example is that if we hold a training, and the training we're looking for equal participation, men and women journalists, something as innocuous or innocent as just booking a training venue, setting a time from 9 to 5 on a Monday, might actually be a huge barrier for certain groups to access our training. So we might see that despite inviting a whole breadth of people, that we only see perhaps men come to our protection trainings. And there's many elements as to why. So it might be because the hotel we chose is not in a convenient location for women to get to. Maybe the time we chose is not conducive for women coming because they have other obligations during the day. Or perhaps the area that we chose is not as safe as it can be. Maybe the timing is, maybe we don't provide childcare because that's one of the barriers to accessing our resources and our events. And so we have to really be critical about how we operationalize our work. And in terms of the digital sphere, in terms of protection, we notice that as well. Our protection work is derived from our Mexico office because of the prevalence of violence of journalists, attacks against journalists there. And we since have been moving it forward. It's now moving forward across all of our regional offices. But we also notice that women don't approach us in terms of getting assistance from our protection. And we have to ask ourselves why. And so, I explained some structural issues that might bar them from joining, but then there are also other issues because perhaps the protection that we're offering overlooks certain elements that are gendered. So perhaps just because the nature of the crimes in Mexico are quite violent and physical, we tend to focus on that firstly, and then now we realize that we have to look at more psychosocial elements and provide that as well. So that's something that we're really moving forward on, ensuring that we provide all elements of protection. So as an international organization, I think as much as we go to the United Nations and speak about pushing forward certain actions and speaking with the media and doing trainings, we also have to be self-critical and self-aware about how we speak about these issues and how we operationalize. And the third element is also having trainings internally because it's an intuitive societal problem. So just having an operational plan and having a strategic plan is insufficient if the officers don't understand the nuances and the complexities of gender issues themselves. So it's a personal, we're approaching it personally, professionally, operationally, strategically, and I think that's something that doesn't have to be within an international organization in terms of addressing it. It can be much more broad in terms of how states and media organizations address it, because I think we have to look at it holistically in order to be effective. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Judy, I would just now like to turn to Ambassador Atlason. I don't know if you can give us your own perspective, from your national perspective, what can be done to deal with this problem. What are the issues that you have come across with in Iceland?
Well, thanks for that, Franne, and good afternoon, everyone. I, in the, as said, says here, I'm the ambassador of Iceland in Austria, but I'm also the permanent representative to this organization, the OSCE. So I guess like Ms. Fjastad is the representative of politics. I may be the representative of at least this diplomatic circle here, the OSCE. But I'm also here as a male colleague, as a father of 2 girls, and 2 boys actually as well, and a husband and a son. Because gender equality, gender issues are a human rights issue for me, and it's a personal issue as well. Before I dive into the questions, allow me to thank you, Franny, and your colleagues for organizing this so far great event, this expert meeting on this important topic. Thanks to Sweden and Lithuania for co-sponsoring. That's an important contribution. And let me also thank Dunia, who unfortunately had to leave for lunch, I guess, and her able office for the leadership and initiative as representative on the freedom of the media, and for drawing attention to the issue that we are discussing today, online abuse of female journalists. This work, and I say that as a representative of my country, and I'm sure I speak on behalf of my colleagues in the OSCE as well, this work is truly appreciated, and in fact it is working, it does bear fruit. I have a small recent example from my own country, Iceland, which I would like to share with you in the beginning. Only last week, Dunia and her colleagues, the representative for the freedom of the media, were in Iceland on Monday and Tuesday. And as in such visits, he met ministers, NGOs, parliamentarians, gave an open talk at the university, and sort of brought the message forward on the safety of journalists, on the importance of freedom of speech, and on this issue, digital threats to female journalists. Only a few days later, on Friday last week, one leading female journalist in Iceland, Ingibjörg Dögg Kjartansdóttir, an easy Icelandic name, as you hear, she published an article in her paper on the website. She's an editor of a paper called Stundin. And if you could kindly go to the next, no, it's on the next website there. This is the article from Ingibjörg, and indeed she is describing the threats that she has repeatedly received. And the title is striking, and it was striking for us in Iceland. It says this is in the Icelandic version, in English it says, I will teach you a lesson, you whore. And this is actually mild to the comments that we heard this morning, unfortunately. And in the article, she describes how she has been threatened and harassed for the last 2 years, allegedly because of an article a male colleague of hers wrote in 2010. So this man is obviously targeting Ingibjörg because of her gender. He is threatening her children. He makes several repetitive abusive sexual remarks. It's the same trend and pattern we are seeing elsewhere. So this article caught some and much attention in Iceland, and Ingibjörg was rightfully praised for her courage to publish these threats, and then that way turn the focus on the abuser, on the perpetrator. And following this article, several other women in journalism came forward with similar stories, and not only, as was also mentioned in the first panel, not only journalists, but just women who show up in media. And I called actually one of them yesterday, who's a professor of law at the University of Reykjavik, and she confirmed what I have heard, that when she gives interviews on TV especially, she only has one rule, and that is to ban her children from answering the phone that evening. And the reason is simple: abusive, sexist comments and threats. And this is in line with what we heard about the scientist that had to withdraw from media. And the reason I'm telling you this and adding to these stories, with our example of Iceland, is firstly because it shows that this problem is most certainly there, and it is everywhere, also in a country like Iceland with 330 proud inhabitants. It is everywhere, and it is not a single event, it is a pattern and a trend which we must take. And secondly, on a more positive note, it shows that institutions like the representative on the freedom of the media, they can actually have an impact, a concrete impact, as we saw in this case. Now, to the questions that Frane was so kind to put to us in the panel. What can we do about this? Which legal commitments do governments have, and how can we effectively use them? Judy has already skillfully described sort of the legal instruments available, so I don't think I have much to add to that. I believe that these legal instruments that are already there, they are quite robust, as you said, and they are to a large extent the same we have to deal with hate speech, sexual abuse, and violence against women. And frankly, I am tempted to conclude from the discussion so far, although of course we need to sort of wave gender into these instruments, I'm tempted to conclude that the problem is not the lack of instruments, but the lack of implementation. So a few words on implementation, if I may. 3 points, in fact: awareness raising, research and data, and the role of men in this regard. And first on awareness, I would like to make the point, or argue, that when stories on online abuse, such as this in Iceland and others, when they come out, we are shocked. And this implies, indirectly at least, that this comes as some sort of a surprise to us. And if this is the case, it also means that there is lack of awareness in our countries. And perhaps one of the reasons is that the female journalists themselves, who are the object of these abuses, they do not report it immediately or may not report it at all. So the problem is obviously there, but it is off our radar and under the surface, and perhaps flourishing therefore. So if we want to tackle this, one of the most important steps is to raise awareness, as I said. No one should have to tolerate being abused, threatened, or harassed based on gender and because of working in the media, like has been said here repeatedly. And we must talk about it in conferences like this. But at the same time, I do realize that this may be easier said than done. It is, of course, not easy to receive such threats as we have heard today and make them public just like that. So those who have done exactly that, Arzu, Caroline, Sissel from Norway who spoke, and Ingibjörg in Iceland, they all deserve our gratitude and compliment for their courage. So awareness must be increased. The second point on research and data. Those who I consulted with when preparing for this distinguished panel, they were not aware of any systematic or reliable data, not much at least. There are sporadic researches here and there. I remember an interview in Guardian with Dunya, and we've heard this morning a few researches mentioned in Maryland and elsewhere. But my point is that it needs to, there's definitely room for improvement. We know this menace exists, but we don't know exactly how widespread it is, how many female journalists have encountered threats of this kind, whether it is old or new, increasing or decreasing. I'm not sure. We can speculate, but we don't have scientific or sociological data on it, not least to my knowledge at least. So more awareness and more research and data is needed, and these two things are interconnected, meaning that when we have more data, we will have more awareness, and our increased awareness will also call for more data. It will strengthen the call for that. So I think it's also important, just on a different note, that this data is very important for our police authorities. One of the points Ingibjörg mentioned in her article, that she was met with some hesitancy in the police station when she wanted to report this. And I wonder if that, like for 10 years ago, we didn't have much data on hate crimes, and therefore little understanding. Now I think we have come a long way, so police authorities are much more aware of those sorts of crimes and are dealing with it more effectively. And finally, the role of men. This is a topic close to my heart because I had the honor this summer to become a point of contact for the Men Engage network in the OSCE. And Men Engage is a network with similar aims as the He for She campaign, which most of you know, the He for She campaign from the UN Women, basically to get men on board on gender equality and achieving gender equality and fighting violence against women. And what we are discussing here, online abuse of female journalists, is certainly one form of violence. So this approach, or this philosophy, if I may, to get men involved, it certainly applies. One point in that respect is that we need to avoid that this issue becomes a women's issue or a female problem somehow. This is not something that female journalists and women organizations should discuss among themselves, to make that point. This is an issue that concerns all of us and need the efforts of us all. And frankly, if we wanted to put this on one of the two genders, this would actually probably be a men's issue, for the simple reason that all of the perpetrators are men. So we men, or more precisely some of our male brothers, are the problem. And so that's why we should be particularly engaged in lifting this issue, trying to understand and to tackle it. And this finally raises the deeper and serious question of why, that some of us have talked about. Why do some men find the urge to abuse and threaten female journalists? What is it in the upbringing of boys and men and in our societies and cultures that allows for this to happen? Do the inherent and enduring stereotypes of masculinity and the relationship between men and women, do they play a role in all of this? Probably yes. And how can we then change that? These are some of the questions that sort of came to me last night when I was thinking about this and preparing. It's complicated. I don't have any simple answers. I believe that, of course, research on domestic violence, on violence against women in conflict, and on hate speech is of use for this particular issue, obviously. But my point on the role of men is also quite simple. We need to look this in the eye as well, and not only be a part of the problem, but become a part of the solution. And with that, I think I'll leave it, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Erdun. And now I would like to turn to Caroline Hammenberg, who will look at it from the perspective of an international organization, what can be done from how to use these international legal norms that we have, what's the role of international organizations in this area. Caroline.
Thank you very much. We're very happy that the OSCE have organized this meeting here today. It's an important issue to highlight, though, as pretty much all of my fellow panelists have pointed out, this is not an issue that can be isolated on its own. It's a gendered phenomenon linked to other issues, such as the tone of the civil discourse online, safety of journalists, and gender equality in society more broadly. So before I touch upon the role of international organizations and what can be done to address these issues, as a representative of UNESCO, I would like to still take the opportunity to refer to some of the more recent international legal instruments and normative documents that can serve as tools in the struggle for safety of journalists and have relevance specifically to today's discussion. Judy laid out the foundations of the basic human rights framework underpinning freedom of expression. And she mentioned the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action, which is now already 20 years ago since it was adopted. But already then, it called on the international community to increase the participation and access of women to expression and decision-making in and through the media and through new technologies. So that was 20 years ago. And in the past 10 years, there have been a number of UN resolutions, both in the Human Rights Council, the General Assembly, and in the Security Council, addressing the safety of journalists and the issue of impunity, and also reaffirming that the same rights that people have offline must also be protected online. Also worth noting, I think, here today, is that both the UN General Assembly and the Security Council have explicitly acknowledged the specific risks faced by women journalists in the exercise of their work. And in this context, they have underlined the importance of taking a gender-sensitive approach when considering measures to address the safety of journalists. This acknowledgement is significant. It's a significant development, relatively recent, to have in writing, as the resolutions have direct impact on the work of the UN and its member states, but also in the way that they can be used by media and civil society to lobby governments and whole member states to account for targeted action on these issues. And on the topic of action, I must also refer to the UN Plan of Action on the Safety of Journalists and the issue of impunity, adopted in 2012, which also makes explicit recognition of the specific risks that female journalists face, And amongst other things, the plan of action has set up a coordinated UN interagency mechanism to handle these issues related to safety of journalists and to assist countries to develop legislation and mechanisms favorable to freedom of expression and information, and support also concrete efforts to implement international norms and principles. And both on the international and national levels, this allows the UN to work together with governments and civil society and media institutions and others in a coordinated response to try to tackle these issues across the field. There both needs to be legal frameworks in place and a capacity to ensure that complaints by female journalists who have experienced online threats and harassment are taken seriously. If the harms from these kinds of threats are not recognized and effectively dealt with, we are sending the signal that they are socially tolerated. And states have a responsibility to ensure that women feel safe to bring their cases to court and that there is no impunity against aggressors. It's interesting to note that at present, many states are in the process of reviewing legislation, generally speaking, to keep up with the evolving digital developments. So in a way, as we talk about these challenges, and to the extent that some of them are new in the digital world, we might also consider it an opportunity that when legislation is under review anyway, to ensure that these specific dimensions are recognized and that recourse mechanisms are included in law where this is an appropriate means of address, or where policies are being reviewed, also updating for the digital environment, to consider these issues in that context as well. All of the resolutions that I mentioned that specifically address risks to women journalists also mention the importance to take a gender-sensitive approach when taking measures to address the safety of journalists. So UNESCO insists on a gender lens applied to all our activities across the board. For example, ahead of this meeting, some of you may have heard of our recent publication on digital safety, which has a specific chapter on the gender perspectives of safety, written by Jennifer Hendrickson. And I would also like to mention this one, which is also relevant for today. It's the upcoming publication on protecting journalism sources in the digital age, where the author Julie Pizzetti also has written a specific gender dimensions chapter of this. And for example, she points out the potential use of digital communication tools to bypass some of the physical risks that women and sources face in the exercise of their work through direct meetings. And it therefore argues that this should serve as an extra incentive to ensure that women are protected from threats and harassment online to fully make use of this potential that digital communication tools could constitute. So, as the discussions here have been showing already, online gendered abuse and threats are not only restricted to conflict environments, and whereas these are often the focus of research, but it's also common in developing countries with highly developed media scenes. And we're noting this, and yet, as Auden and others have pointed out, there is quite limited targeted research on this phenomenon, which also prevents us from formulating forceful remedial action. It is a problem, and UNESCO also strongly encourages research projects in this field. We're very happy about this initiative here today. And from UNESCO's side, we have engaged in several projects with the aim to address these issues in the past years. For example, we have worked with INSEE and the International Women's Media Foundation and the Austrian government on the survey on violence and harassment against women in the news media. And upcoming in December, we're about to launch a new research network on women, media, and ICTs together with the Global Alliance on Media and Gender in Geneva. But these are just some of the ongoing efforts, but there is clearly a global gap in this field which require mobilization of sector-wide resources to address. And then before finishing, to allow some questions also, I'd just like to come back to some last points on the role of international organizations to combat this issue. It could be said that states can sometimes be more comfortable with discussing issues on the international scene than domestically, to bring these issues to the international forum can therefore allow for advancement on topics which would otherwise not be raised. International organizations have experience in organizing discussions on difficult topics. This is one of their roles. They can pool expertise and develop best practices as reference points for states and other actors to look at. And lastly, it's worth remembering that problems with an online dynamic also often have a trans-border or transnational element to them, which can't solely be solved through domestic action. And as such, the transnational multi-stakeholder approach that UNESCO highlights when discussing other issues of freedom of expression and privacy in the digital sphere is also an important aspect of tackling online abuse of women journalists, I think. So these are some points out there.
Thank you very much, Caroline. I was also, during the presentation, quickly looking at the Twitter feed that we also have going on the hashtag to see if there are any questions or comments that could be done. So those of you who are watching live web streaming, feel free to send us your comments and suggestions via the Twitter hashtag. If I can, before turning the floor to the questions, in a way, recap some of the issues that were raised. I think Maya made the important issue that also our office very strongly believes in. It's the need to protect the internet as a resource, as a free resource, a resource for communication, and that our human rights are online are actually the same as offline, and Judy underlined that as well in terms of international commitments, international legal frameworks. It does not differentiate between the two worlds because essentially they are all part of our everyday lives. In a way, treating these attacks, whether they are online or offline, is a threat to democracy, and as such they need to be dealt in a way. The penalties need to reflect that these threats are also threats to democracy. So attacks on journalists, whether they happen online or offline, should reflect that. So, but to have a full democratic internet, we need also the participation of everybody, which includes I think 52% of the population, which is women as well. They need to feel to be part of it. Aidan gave us, I think, an important point here, that the root cause of this could very much lie in the fact how women are treated in generally in the society. It's not just an online problem. And I apologize for the difficulty in hearing us. There are some works going on